Trump-hating never-Trumpers, Trump-hating election officials. Anybody who's critical of Donald Trump is a hater of Trump. And that has become increasingly their, so to speak, Trump card, right? So I've had long conversations with people exploring why they believe certain things. And one of the ways that I've noticed increasingly that they reject empirical evidence is they say, well, you're just a Trump hater. And they don't want to go through the hard work of actually exploring empirical evidence or science or in the case of the election being stolen. It simply was not true. And when I've engaged with them, long emails, to see how their mind works, which is to ignore the question or to shift to a different topic, but they just can't concede it. So what they say is, yes, you're lying to me. None of the claims that you're making is true.
Well, hello there, Faithful Politics listeners. If you're joining us on our podcast stream, and watchers, if you're joining us via YouTube, thanks so much for being with us today. We have another episode of Faithful Politics Podcast. I'm your faithful host, Josh Bertram. And of course, we have Will, our political host. It's good to see you, Will.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks, Josh.
Absolutely. And today we're excited to have with us Peter Wehner. He is a prominent political commentator, author, and senior fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Peter has a distinguished career in public service, including roles in the Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush administrations, where he served as the deputy director of speechwriting and later as the director of the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives. In addition to his government work, Peter is a prolific writer and thinker, contributing to major publications such as the New York Times, The Atlantic, in which he just wrote a recent article on the what Christianity has done well, or something along those lines. I apologize. But writing for The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and he is known for his insightful analysis on the intersection of politics, religion, and culture, and has authored several books, including The Death of Politics, How to Heal Our Frayed Republic After Trump. Peter, it's great to have you on the show today. Sorry I butchered your article title. I just didn't have it right in front of me when I was talking.
That's fine. Josh, thanks for having me on, and Will as well. I don't have the article in front of me either, so I don't know what the title is. Just one thing on the bio.
The greatest contribution of Christianity. There you go.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, just on the bio, I'm actually at a place called the Trinity Forum. So I had been at Ethics and Public Policy Center for 15 years, and I'm now at the Trinity Forum, which is an institution which I'm very proud to be associated with. And they actually deal very explicitly with Christianity and public life. So it's a world that I've been involved with for most of my career. But in any event, it's great to be with you guys.
Yes, thank you so much, and I appreciate that correction there. And we'll try to put links to all these things so people can check them out when they're looking at the show notes. So you've obviously had a long and prestigious career in politics and writing. Can you share a little bit more about your journey that kind of came to have you focus on the intersection of Christianity and politics?
Sure. So I was born in Dallas, grew up in Washington State. Those were my formative years. A city called Richland, which is in southeast Washington. Went to University of Washington in Seattle, and UW Husky, and came out to Washington D.C. area my senior year through an internship, and that was in the 1980s, and that really started my political career. So I was in the think tank world. And then I was hired in my mid-20s as a speechwriter for then Secretary of Education William Bennett, who was in the Reagan administration, and worked in various administrations that Reagan, George H.W. Bush. Then I was in the George W. Bush White House as Deputy Director of Speechwriting, and I was Director of something called the Office of Strategic Initiatives, which is a kind of in-house White House think tank. So politics has been my career. I've either been a practitioner of it or written about it since I was a young man. And in terms of faith, so I began my journey as a Christian in my high school years. and it was really I would say a journey that was intellectual and cognitive. Did not come naturally to me, didn't come particularly easily to me. It was the product of a lot of conversations and a lot of discussions with people. Ultimately, for me, the entry point, I would say, was historical. I focused a lot on the resurrection, whether that was real or not, and the crucifixion. Those two things. Actually, I wrote a paper at UW in my English 171 class on the case for and against the resurrection. University of Washington was not a Christian school, but I got the okay from my teaching assistant, so I did that, and so that was instrumental in my faith, and then a whole
That's
series of things, individuals, experiences, journeys, questions, conversations over the course of my life, which led me at that relatively young age to Christianity. But I've been a question asker in all areas of my life, but including in faith to this very day. So if you were in touch with pastors and theologians that I know, and I've gotten to know a lot over my life, there are often questions about the Christian faith, everything from were the accounts in Joshua and Deuteronomy about the massacre of the Canaanites and children accurate, to what happens to the 14-year-old in the African continent who dies in a tsunami and hasn't professed faith in Christ, what happens to that person? So those have just been a part of my my journey. I think for me, it was natural that I would write on both faith and politics because both were central to my life. I'd say faith has been more fundamental to my life than politics, but both matter to me. Both take up a fair amount of my thought. And so I've written a lot on politics. I've written a fair amount on faith, on meditations of faith, primarily for the New York Times, but also for other publications, including The Atlantic. My two main organs of publishing are the New York Times and The Atlantic. And then I've written frequently on the intersection of faith and politics, particularly in the Trump era, since that's been a prominent issue and one that I found disturbing and puzzling and important to try and sort through.
Yeah, I just have to say I really appreciate just the work you do, your representation of the Christian faith, because it's so needed. Because most of the exposure that I think Americans get to the Christian faith it's not great.
Yeah, right.
Lightly. And folks like you, Tim Alberta and some others can sort of bring their Christian faith to the forefront, to these major media organizations, and represent it in a way where people are like, yeah, that's the kind of Christianity that I would imagine would be prevalent amongst all Christians, but it's not. So I'm curious on why isn't your style, and that's probably a bad way to phrase it, your way of practicing your faith, and Tim Alberta's way of practicing his faith, not more mainstream, you think?
Yeah, well, thank you. Thanks, Will. Those are kind words. I appreciate them. And Tim is a wonderful writer, and I'm sure you both know or familiar with his book, The Kingdom and the Power. And people like Tim are important, I think, precisely because he's a person who is a believer and understands the world of faith. I think a lot of times people critique faith from the outside, so they don't really understand it. Their perspective is certainly worth listening to, but it's not the sum total of what's happening. And I think it's important to listen to people from within the faith as they're trying to sort through why are there fewer people like Tim and myself, and I would say David French, maybe Russell Moore, Beth Moore, a few others. I'd say several things about that. One is that this Trumpian moment has both revealed certain things about faith and people of faith and what is central to their own self-understanding, to their core identity. I think it's both revealed it and in my estimation, amplified the worst elements of it. And I think a second thing is that most of the people who are willing to speak out on very direct political and partisan matters tend to be in MAGA world and Trump world. A lot of people who are not particular supporters of Trump or MAGA ethic tend not to speak out, not necessarily because they're afraid, although I think fear plays into it. But for a lot of them, they just don't think it's appropriate. They've grown up, in many cases, pastors went into the ministry not because they wanted to speak out on politics or that they feel they're particularly well equipped to speak out on politics, but because they want to do ministry work. Also, in this era, it's so polarizing. I've had countless conversations with pastors and theologians just how divisive this moment is, including for the church. And it's being divided by politics. COVID divided it. And then beyond the particular issues, I think there's a kind of disposition that's taken over in the church, which is representative of the wider world, wider society, which is a kind of antipathy, quickness to judge, a certain harshness, and the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, have been obliterated in the name of ideology. I do think it's the thing I alluded to earlier, which is, I would say, more than I realized, the core identity for a lot of people who claim in good faith to be Christians and who themselves would say Christianity and Jesus are most central to their life. I don't think that in reality is true, or it's not true enough. I think all of us are products of dozens of other factors: family of origin, race, country that we live in, the era in which we live in, maybe the region of the country that we live in, the communities we've been a part of, the communities we are a part of, the jobs that we do. So many factors, and those form who we see ourselves to be. And I think for a lot of Christians, it's no different. So we are drawn almost instantaneously to a whole set of issues, to see them a certain way, to look at them through a certain prism. And then we backfill what we already believe by proof texting the scripture and saying, well, this is what the Bible teaches. But in fact, what it is, it's a kind of lawyer's brief, right? You have a client, you represent your client, and you put forward the case to defend your client. Whether you believe that client is innocent or not, that's your duty. And I think a lot of Christians have very deep commitment, in this case, to certain psychology, certain sociology, certain political partisan views, and then they go and they justify it by invoking the scripture. So I think people made a lot of Christians, white evangelicals, made their inner peace with Donald Trump relatively early, 2016. I think there was some unease with that, but as time went on, as they've made one concession after another, the psychology of accommodation kicked in, and they began to jettison that voice of conscience that said this should trouble you, at least to some extent, and it became more and more tribalistic. The net effect is, I think, a terrible witness for the Christian church. And as you were saying earlier, I think if you're a non-believer and you just wanted to say, well, what does the white evangelical movement believe? You'd be horrified by what it seems to represent. So I'm glad that there are some voices out there that are trying to say there's a different way and that faith can be understood in a different way.
Yeah, I often say on the show, I came to the faith in 2008. My wife was a pastor's kid, and so it sort of my belief kind of came with the territory. I sort of say that tongue in cheek, but if I were not a believer today, I would have a hard time coming to the faith, and I think that Christians would really benefit from just realizing how difficult we're making it. Like, we are the barriers for people to know Jesus, and it's like, I always like to tell some of my friends that want to make fun of me for my faith. I was like, yeah, it's weird. Like, I believe this dude, like, was born from a virgin death. He died and came back again. Like, that's what I believe, and I'm like, right. And that's a hard hill to kind of get over.
Right. And
then you add on, the Capitol riots, the Christian nationalism, all these other things. And I'm like, it doesn't surprise me that church attendance is going down like as much. Like, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're right. What is the argument for the Christian faith is not easy in a lot of ways. I mean, it involves miracles and things that are supernatural and contrary to a lot of what we see. So that's a hard, that's a high hurdle to get over. And then the question is, you're clearing the hurdle for what exactly? To become part of this moral freak show?
Right.
So your avatar, the person that in the entire political galaxy, the person that you're drawn to is a man of undisguised moral corruption, and in every sphere of his life, personal, political, and business world. And on top of that, you were the same people that were lecturing us on morality and political leadership for decades, including in the 90s with Bill Clinton. You were taking a figurative 2x4 upside the head because of an affair with Monica Lewinsky. And now you've got a guy who was found liable of sexual assault that the judge referred to as rape, who's been the subject of 24 complaints about sexual harassment and sexual abuse, and a man who has been found guilty of fraud and who encouraged his own supporters to hang his own vice president, and also was instrumental in trying to overturn an election, and also instigated a violent assault on the Capitol, and is a pathological liar. This is the man you've decided to defend and vote for. It just doesn't square. It rightly doesn't square.
Yeah.
So trying to get people to accept the faith has its own intrinsic challenges in any era. And then you add to that, this, and you'd say, like, who would want to be a part of this club anyway? So it's tough. I'd say for me personally, that's been the most painful thing of the last nearly decade of time, which is to see what has happened to the Christian witness, and to see people whom I had thought better of or whom I had respected and have, in my estimation, for a variety of complicated reasons, which we can talk about, jettisoned things that they believed to be true and knew to be true in order to get onto this Trump train. And so it's a messy reality that we're facing right now.
It is, and I'm a pastor, and my wife and I did a church plant, and we're trying to have, really focus on relationship, right. on really focus on the sense of a family, the sense of a unit, the sense of that discipleship, going deeper with people, taking time with people. And there are so many forces that are that the church that I feel it has to react to. One, we just interviewed one of the leaders in the Pew Research Center, and they had a study that essentially said that it was amazing. It said 5% of people think it's appropriate to try to convince someone else of your views in either religion or politics. 5%. That's it. It was a larger group that said you should listen. It was another huge group that said you shouldn't even talk about it.
Right.
5% were okay with what we would kind of think about as proselytizing.
Right.
This idea of talking to people about the faith. And I know a huge part of what's going on and everything, all the data that I've seen, all the studies that I've seen is this seeming marriage between the church and the Republican Party,
right?
The Evangelical Church and the Republican Party. And having worked in politics for decades, right? Having served under 3 different Republican presidents, I want to dig in more as to what is it that's really going on that's getting people to, as you say, jettison these kinds of formational beliefs, even about things like someone's character and a leader's character, things like that. Like, why is it that people are so supportive of Trump? I know that I voted for him in 2016 because of the Supreme Court was essentially, and because I didn't want Hillary in there, I didn't vote for him in 2020, don't plan to in 2024, but so many people I know and respect and love do,
right,
and will,
right.
And it's a real, how have you wrestled through this tension, and what do you see as the differences? Why is this happening?
Yeah, no, it's a very good and probing question, Josh. I mean, I'd see several things to it as I understand it. Maybe the first thing to say is that this allegiance between a lot of evangelical Christians and the Republican Party and how that came to be. And the reason I mention it is because I think it's central to understand because it explains a certain tribalism, right? Once you have joined a tribe, that begins to shape how you see things, and it's often difficult for people to break with it. That story, in short, is that beginning right around the mid-1970s or so, maybe a little bit earlier, evangelicals who had been more or less on the sidelines of politics, in many cases for what they believed to be theological reasons, which you could see manifest in the Anabaptist movement and the Plymouth Brethren, to take a more extreme example. But for much of the 20th century, there was the notion that faith and politics didn't mix. And it was actually because, for example, if you listen to Jerry Falwell in the mid-1960s, who was an independent Baptist, he said, our job is to save souls and not to be involved in the things of the world, and that the world is corrupting. And so we have no role in it. Now, Falwell's a complicated figure. He was a segregationist, a sharp critic of King, so he found time to be able to speak to it when he desired to. But as a general matter, that more or less defined the evangelical movement, and yet the evangelical modernist controversy and that break in the latter part of the 20th century. Roe v. Wade happens. It's misunderstood for a lot of people. That did not catalyze a lot of Protestant Christians into politics. Their views were complicated on abortion. The SBC was actually pro-choice at the time. It was the Catholics who were most strongly pro-life. That changed over time. But there were a whole series of decisions and political events that happened in the 70s. This was in the aftermath of the sexual revolution and the generation gap in the late 60s and 70s. Then you had gay ordinances, the issues that were coming up. Anita Bryant, for example, was involved in some of these. There were some regulations that the Carter administration was putting forward having to do with Christian schools that a lot of white evangelicals balked against. So they begin to get involved in politics. The evangelical vote in 76 between Ford and Carter is basically split. It was slightly for Ford, but not by much. Then you get to 1980 with Reagan. 79, moral majority is formed. Then you have Pat Robertson, the 700 Club, and you have a whole group of people that are involved in politics, both pastors and also intellectuals and theologians who are arguing that you need to get involved in politics, primarily at this point for the pro-life issue, but others as well. And there's this allegiance that happens with Reagan. So Reagan wins about 2/3 of the evangelical vote in 80, and by 84 against Mondale around 3/4 or so. And then for all those decades afterward, the Republican Party is the home for most white evangelicals because they feel like the Republican Party represents their views on a whole range of issues, including moral issues and including at this point abortion, but others too. So that's the state of things by the time you get to 2015, 2016, when Trump enters the scene. You've got basically 2 generations of white evangelicals who felt this is my home, the Republican Party. Trump takes over the party. I mean, he wins the nomination, and he does it against a whole list of impressive candidates from different segments of the Republican movement, the conservative movement. You had libertarians like Rand Paul. You had social conservatives like Rick Santorum and Mike Huckabee. You have people like more moderate conservative, people like John Kasich and Jeb Bush and Chris Christie. And then you had right-wing people like Ted Cruz. So you basically had your whatever flavor of ice cream you wanted. And yet the people chose in overwhelming numbers in the primaries Donald Trump. And the question was, why would they choose Trump, who himself had been pro-choice, even allowing partial birth abortion, had given money to the Clintons, and was not a Republican by any traditional standards? They jettisoned all of those beliefs to side with Trump. So the question was, why would that be the case? I think the reason is that Trump's ethic, his crudity, his cruelty, his aggression, the way he talked, appealed to a lot of them. So why was that? Why would that have happened? I think that an awful lot of evangelicals over many decades felt dishonored and disrespected by the elite culture. I think there was something to that. I think it was overstated in large measure, but there's no question the elite culture, for whether it's media or universities, elite universities and so forth, looked down with people of faith who held traditional views. So you have the situation in which people feel dishonored and disrespected, and this is building up. That gives way to resentments and grievances. And Trump comes in and he gives voice to those resentments and grievances. And he says, I'm going to bring essentially signals to them. I'm going to bring a pistol to a cultural knife fight. And I'm going to take these people out because they hate you and you hate them. And I am the vehicle for your hate, and I am the vehicle for your vengeance. And that appeals to a lot of them. Others, at the time, I had these discussions contemporaneously, felt like, his style is sort of a bug, not a feature. I'm somewhat uncomfortable, but he's going to shake things up. I had one person in the church that I attended at the time who wrote me a note, didn't disagree with any of my criticisms of Trump, but he said, what of the establishment guys, Mitt Romney, John McCain, George W. Bush, what have they given us? Barack Hussein Obama. Note the emphasis on the middle name, Hussein. It's signaling that he's not one of us. And so they said, Trump is rough around the edges, but he's gonna burn down the parts of the establishment that deserve to be burned down. So he taps into that. And then the last thing I'll say is, if you read Kristen Dumais, who wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne, which is a very thoughtful book, and it goes over the history of the evangelical movement, she makes a very important point, I think, which is, because she knows the evangelical movement. She said Trump was in many ways the personification of what they were looking for. Most people say he's an anathema to what they were looking for because of his immorality. She said, no, in terms of him as a kind of warrior, he's a personification of what they wanted. So they go for him in 2016, and then with each line that he transgresses, they accommodate themselves to it. And this creates an enormous potential cognitive dissonance. Just how do people who proclaim to be followers of Jesus give their allegiance to this man, not just to vote for him, but to always defend him? And on its face, that creates an enormous internal tension, right? This is at odds with what I say I believe. And there, what happens is human psychology and the mind. It begins to mitigate the cognitive dissonance by saying he's not as bad as they say he is, and the opponents are much worse than they say he is. So we now are facing an existential struggle. This is not an ordinary election. This is the coming of the Nazi regime. This is the Bonhoeffer moment. We have to use unethical means to win the greater good. And if Hillary Clinton wins in 2016, or if Joe Biden wins, the country as we know it will die. They're coming after me. They're coming after my children. And if Donald Trump is the person that we have to side with in order to defeat these people, if he's the guardian at the gates, if he's the watchman on the walls, then we're with him because the stakes are so high. So it's a complicated mix. It's a long-winded answer, but I don't think it lends itself to an easy understanding. But that's basically mine.
That's really, really insightful. And, I appreciate everything you said, because
very insightful.
So we created we created a 5-part audio document. I think I put this in my email. I'll never pass up an opportunity to self-promote. But like, we did a documentary about Christian nationalism, 5 parts. First part talks about the founding of the country as a Christian nation, unquote. Second's about church and state. Anyways, like the 4th episode is all about Trump and the religious right. It's titled "Choosing Barabbas." And we have psychologists, we have cult experts, some other folks. I think Andrew Whitehead is in that episode because he wrote a book on American idolatry. Great book,
right?
And it really sort of gets at the heart of Christians latching on to power,
right?
And your most recent article in The Atlantic, called Eastern Christianity's Relationship with Power, does explore this relationship. So I'd love for you to maybe kind of elaborate a little bit more about the article, the contents, and who's Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah, sure. The essay, which was an Easter essay that I did, starts out with recounting a conversation that I had with Christopher Hitchens and his brother 15 years ago. Christopher Hitchens was one of the most prominent new atheists. Christopher died several years ago now of esophageal cancer. And I had gotten to know Christopher, and he was a friend, even though he was a fierce atheist, more reasonable, I would say, in private than he was in public, but was certainly had strong opinions. And so I was at this event with Christopher and Peter, his brother, who is a Christian, and I asked each of them, in a sense, to return their own serve. That is, to say what it was that they considered the strongest argument of the other. So for Peter, what was the strongest argument against on behalf of atheism, and for Christopher, what was the strongest case on Christianity? And when I asked Christopher his views on the strongest case for Christianity, he said something to the effect of how ephemeral power was, and he learned this young when he was at Christian schools, and I use that as a launching point to meditate on the crucifixion and Christianity and power, and how interesting and unusual, in some ways sui generis, the Christian faith is, because it is a faith of anti-power, and that was personified, I think, preeminently on the cross and the crucifixion, but also in the teachings of Jesus, which turned so many common understandings of the time on their head. Blessed are the weak, blessed are the poor, the last shall be first, my kingdom is not of this world. And so Jesus his coming kingdom was not the kingdom that a lot of people of his time expected, which was a kingdom of ruling in the world, like King David. His kingdom was of a very different kind. And if you look at the growth of the Christian church in the first 2.5, 3 centuries, and sociologists and historians have documented this, people like Rodney Stark and others, it had nothing to do with Christian political power. I mean, it was the Roman Empire at that point was pre-Constantine, and it had no real political power. In fact, it was the opposite. They were marginalized, often under attack. Yet it spread at an enormous rate. I mean, there are disputes and debates about how much. Stark says there was a 40% increase each decade. Others say that was too high. But whatever the rate was, by the 2nd, 3rd century, it was the dominant religion in the world. And how was that? And it was because Christians were noted for their love, for their outreach to the poor, to children, to people who were sick and diseased, their self-sacrifice, their willingness to welcome in people on the margins of society. Then if you look at Christian history since that time, it's not a mathematical equation, but it's close to it, which is any time that Christians have gained power, that it is Christians who have suffered. Usually it's people in power who change Christians, not Christians who change people in power. And right. I know in my own experience that the group that has been most susceptible to the seductions of political power have been Christians. They're the most easily who can be brought into power and who give their allegiance to political figures. Think Chuck Colson in Kingdoms in Conflict wrote about that. Colson was a significant figure. He was a Nixon hatchet man before he became a Christian. In the 1970s, he founded Prison Fellowship, and he reported the same thing. I think it's several things going on. I think for a lot of Christians, there's a sense that if we can get the mechanisms of power, the instruments of power, we can do enormous good. And that's a legitimate argument, right? Because politics matters. And when politics goes well, it can advance human flourishing. And when it goes poorly, it can lead to human devastation. So they convince themselves if we get the levers of power, we can get in place the right policies, which is going to do enormous good. It turns out it's a lot harder than that. And what is often unstated is this notion for Christians of a kind of what David Brooks, a friend of mine, calls moral superiority complex, but intellectual inferiority complex. They morally think they're superior to other people. Intellectually, they feel like they're inferior, or they feel like they've been dealt that way. So for Christians to have a chance to be welcomed at the seats of power is it's like a kid with his face pressed up against the window of a toy store. Or think about as another analogy, if you're middle school and you have a kid who has been socially awkward his entire life. He's not part of the cool kids group. Maybe he's been bullied to some extent, but he's been on the periphery, on the outskirts. And that's been wounding to him, and that's been hurtful to him. And one day he's invited to sit at the cool kids table for lunch. And he's brought in. And when that happens, that is such an important moment for him. So many past wounds feel like they've been put aside. And that kid, once he's invited to the cool kids table, will do anything to stay at that table. And if he were asked to leave that table, it would be a kind of death. He would feel that would be a kind of death. I think for a lot of Christians, that's how it is. Yeah. They've long, even though they themselves use the rhetoric of saying, my kingdom is not of this world, the world is in the power of the evil one, they long to be accepted by it. And once they are, it's very, very hard. If you listen, for example, to Robert Jeffress, pastor of a mega church in Dallas, talk about Trump and his time with Trump, you can just see it's just radiating that this is an affirmation to him. And for him to be able to say that he spent time with Trump, or I've been invited to the Oval Office, or I've been in the Roosevelt Room and I'm listened to, that is a huge validation for him and for those like him. So I think we just have to acknowledge that that's a reality. And these kind of human impulses, they don't change nearly as much as they should when we become Christians. Those things still remain. And in many cases, they overwhelm what should be Christian temperaments and casts of mind.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I find myself very, very sympathetic to everything that you're saying. I went on a journey from being very right-wing. I mean, I still consider myself very conservative. I mean, certainly my views on LGBTQIA issues with the culture would find them very conservative. My views on a lot of the major issues would probably be seen as conservative, but I would not be seen as conservative when it comes to Trump, and people would want to kick me out. And one of the things that I would love to get your thoughts on is I hear this, and I would love you to respond to this. Let's say something comes out about, you're naming any of the things that Trump has done. Right. How could we support this person? And they say, something along the lines that I've heard. Well, I mean, that's the liberal media telling you that.
Right.
They're lying to you, don't you? Like, number one, they're lying to you. Number two, the government's lying to you. Number three, how can you trust these people that essentially are coming out with all this stuff that's lies?
Right.
What role has the quote unquote distrust of the liberal media and even seeing that shift, right? Because you mentioned how it felt like Christians were treated by the liberal media, by elites. What role has that played? I'd love for you to dig a little bit more into that for us. Yeah,
no, what you're describing is a very common experience, and I've encountered it countless times. The distrust in the so-called mainstream media, liberal media, is enormous. It can't be overstated. It's existed for decades and decades. But there were key moments, inflection points, which changed. I would say the first one was Fox News, which came into being in the mid '90s as a counterweight to the liberal media, and I think was responsible by and large in the '90s. So, example, when Brit Hume was the host of Special Report, and they would have Charles Krauthammer and Fred Barnes and Mark Kondracki and a whole series of commentators. I think that they gave their motto at the time was fair, balanced, and unafraid. I think was what they used, and I think that they did offer a different view from the media, which tended to be liberal. There's just no question. I mean, there was empirical study after empirical study that showed that the people at ABC, NBC, CBS, which were the dominant networks at that time, were liberal leaning in their orientation. So I think that was actually a helpful corrective. But what happens is it went further and further. So Fox News is now essentially a propaganda outfit. It's the equivalent of Russian television, TV. But what was at least as important, and I think probably to some extent even more important, was social media. Which, if you read what social media and the internet was supposed to do to people at the time, was to bring people together, and in fact, it's driven them apart. I think in terms of what you're talking about, Josh, the phenomenon that's happening is that there have always been people who believe in conspiracy theories and are on the fringes. I mean, that's as old as time, certainly as old as human beings have been around and sentient, right? But what is different now is that people who believe in conspiracy theories can now congregate and create a community, which is never possible before. And we know the kind of profile in which conspiracy theories appeal to. Often they're people who are lonely or disconnected. They have a predisposition toward conspiracy theories. They're longing to be a part of a community. Often they're people who haven't fit in comfortably to communities that exist otherwise. So they're invited into these communities. Their views are reinforced, and then you have this phenomenon of the capacity to link to studies, quote unquote studies, which are themselves conspiracy based, but appear to be true and authentic. Most importantly, they validate what these people already believe. So you have this new phenomenon taking advantage of what are pre-existing human tendencies and giving them enormous power and enormous sway. And I've experienced this. And just one illustration. During COVID, I had conversation with a friend of ours, formerly a neighbor, thoughtful guy. We talked a lot of things that were going on, catching up in life. Well, then we got into COVID, and he was absolutely insistent that hydroxychloroquine was a cure to COVID, which is not true. It's just not objectively not true, but he believed deeply in this. And so I was exploring, why do you believe this? And he was telling me why and coming up with these sources that he believed in. And when I said, look, why do you think that Francis Collins and Tony Fauci and virtually every epidemiologist, virologist in the world says that this isn't true? These are people who have committed their lives to healing people. This is their profession. And his answer was follow the money. So what he meant by that was a context of China and pharmaceuticals. Basically, these people were being bought off. And so he was willing to disregard every empirical study, whether it came from the UK or from the National Institutes of Health or the Centers for Disease Control or anywhere else, because it went contrary to what he wanted. And we then later had an email exchange, and he sent me links that I knew within 30 seconds was a conspiracy website. But it had the patina of seriousness that he could look to. What was most important to understand is it validated what he already believed. So there was this distrust that had happened, which was tied to what I was mentioning earlier, which were these grievances. So you now have an entire large cohort of people who will say on the matter of Trump that every single charge that has been made against him is not true. It's the product of liberal media, liberal prosecutors. The term of art that I've experienced a lot personally and more broadly, if you listen to right-wing radio is Trump haters. Trump-hating prosecutors, Trump-hating judges, Trump-hating never-Trumpers, Trump-hating election officials. Anybody who's critical of Donald Trump is a hater of Trump. And that has become increasingly their, so to speak, Trump card, right? So I've had long conversations with people exploring why they believe certain things. And one of the ways that I've noticed increasingly that they reject empirical evidence is they say, well, you're just a Trump hater. And they don't want to go through the hard work of actually exploring empirical evidence or science or in the case of the election being stolen. It simply was not true. And when I've engaged with them, long emails, to see how their mind works, which is to ignore the question or to shift to a different topic, but they just can't concede it. And so what they say is, yes, you're lying to me. None of the claims that you're making is true. So just the other week, I was having lunch with a pastor, good guy, conservative. He himself would say that Trump is morally corrupt. But what was really fascinating to me is when I brought up 5 or 6 particulars, the E. Jean Carroll case where he was found liable of sexual assault, hanging the vice president, the whole litany that I went through, he denied every one of the particulars, even though he himself was willing to say that Trump was corrupt. But back to what we were talking about earlier, I don't think he, as a minister, as not a MAGA person who drunk the Kool-Aid, I don't think he could live easily with himself by conceding that Trump was as bad as Trump actually is. So he had to deny each one. He lives sort of within the right-wing media. So he was able to say, well, this isn't true, or I can't believe that, Trump really wanted the vice president to be hung and so forth and so on. Now, when you encounter people with that, it's very, very hard to get through to them. And some people you just simply can't get through because you're in a different epistemological universe. To the degree that you can reach them, in my experience, it's only if there is a relationship of trust in other arenas of life. If you know what they're going through, maybe struggles with their wife or their children, maybe it's a medical challenge, maybe it's questions about their faith that they really aren't comfortable airing with anybody else. And then there's a human relationship that takes place. That's the only time that I've seen those walls kind of go down. But if you make a set of arguments, empirical arguments, even if you do it in a very polite tone, but a direct tone, they feel that that's an attack on their core identity. That's what's happening. It's like, this is what I believe. This is central to who I am. This is a very deeply held conviction. And anytime any of us have our core identities, we feel like it's under attack. Our tendency is to lash out and not to listen well. So I think that's what's happening. I think it's happening in an awful lot of churches. I talk to a lot of pastors and theologians, and the number of churches that are being split by this, or even if they're not being split politically, but the ethos of anger, of judgment, of being short-tempered, the antithesis of the fruit of the Spirit, that's pervading a lot of churches and making life as difficult for pastors like you as I think any moment in generations.
Wow. The COVID thing especially is like, we all lived through it. And my son So my son had a brain tumor removed about a year ago. He's 10.
I'm sorry.
And he's undergoing chemotherapy and all this stuff. It's a long story. We did a whole episode on it. And when people talk to me about vaccinations and the COVID vaccine, I tell them, I'm like, yeah, like I got my child vaccinated. They're like, oh, you're going to put that poison in his body. And I was like, look, my child has a team of doctors around him. and I've asked all of them, like, hey, what do you guys think about the vaccine? Oh yeah, he should definitely get it, And I'm like, okay, great. That's all I need to hear, But knowing that this existed during sort of the height of COVID, Josh and I had on the health secretary for Virginia. Gosh, I wish I just remembers Daniel something, but we had him on, and we had the health person for West Virginia. So left and right. And we asked them essentially almost the same questions, like, hey, what do you think about vaccines? Horse medication.
Yeah.
Like we just went down the list, and they both said the exact same thing. So I totally get it when you like tell somebody, hey, here's some objective truths. Here are experts that have no whatever political like reason to lie to me. Then they still are like, no. There's Soros, something, QAnon, Mike Flynn, whatever, and it's really, really bad. And then they add sort of the religious element to it of, you should just trust in God. You don't need the vaccine. Just trust in God.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, and all that said to lead up to this question, like you've been in this world a long time. Not like I'm not calling you old, but I'm saying like you've been sort of in the faith politics like arena much longer than we have. Like, is this sort of a pivotal moment, you think, in the Christian faith? And how does that compare to, we experienced like the religious right, the moral majority, all the Bob Jones, Paul Weyrich, Falwell stuff. Like, is this different, you think?
Yeah. First, thanks for sharing your story on your son. I'm sorry, Will, that you've had to go through that. We haven't faced that. And so as a parent, that has got to be in a nightmare situation. So I'm sorry for you and your son, and I hope he's healing.
0 out of 10 don't recommend.
Yeah. I can imagine that. In terms of if this is a pivotal moment, I would say it's a key moment in American Christianity, at least. Christianity has obviously a 2,000-year history, and Christianity is on the rise in the global South, and it's dying in much of Western Europe, and America has its own story. I do think that this moment's different than the other ones you described, the moral majority moments, the Weyrich moments. In some respects, it's not that different, because I think the sensibilities that you're seeing today have been around for 50 years. I mean, if you listen to what Falwell and Pat Robertson said after the attack on 9/11, right? They said, well, this is God's judgment on America. It's because of our stance on homosexuality, and it's a stance on abortion. And this is an immoral society, and we had it coming. And this, or you read even Francis Schaeffer, who had different iterations in terms of his life, and he was one of the central intellectual theological figures that got the Christian right involved in politics. He wrote with C. Everett Koop about abortion, and he wrote a book in the early 1980s with a sort of catastrophism, that what happens if in terms of the life of this country if progressives win or secular society prevails. So those fears, those concerns, those resentments, that catastrophic mindset has existed really since that moment. I think what's different now is the leaders of the Republican Party in the past were people like Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush, right? So they were bulwarks against the worst and most extreme elements, and they would call out some of the worst and extreme elements. That was true of Mitt Romney. It was true of John McCain, right? There's a clip, if you go back to the 2008 election, where a pro-McCain Republican woman is going after Obama for being a terrorist and for being a Muslim. And McCain says, I disagree with my opponent, but that's not true of him, right? So you had those kind of figures. What Trump did and what makes this moment different is he not just only tapped into these things, as I said earlier, but amplified them and validated them and pushed them further and further and further. And so his ethic became their ethic. And now you have, 80% of white evangelicals will vote for Trump in 2024, probably more than that. And it's not simply that, but it's all of the baggage that goes along with that they've adopted. They've adopted the Trump ethic. And for more people than I think we would like to admit, they find that ethic to be vivifying, to be life-giving, to be energizing. As people often like to create narratives in which they're the heroes of their own drama. And so they've created in politics this drama of the children of light against the children of darkness. This is God versus Satan. And we're on the side of God. And this is a great and grand struggle. And we're actors in that drama. And we're even heroes in that drama. And that's the kind of self-justification that you can do that can lead you to very, very dark and even ugly places. And it's not going to end anytime soon. Because what's happened is the Trump ethic has spread, has created countless acolytes, whether you're talking about Matt Gaetz or Marjorie Taylor Greene or Lauren Boebert or J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio or Franklin or Lindsey Graham. Franklin Graham is his own story, like one of the leaders of the evangelical movement. Eric Metaxas, we mentioned Robert Jeffress. So you have these people who have adopted that ethic and that approach to politics and celebrate it, and will target and go after people who stand against it. Eric Metaxas is an interesting example. He wrote a book on Bonhoeffer in the 2010s, I think, which was a shoddy book, quite honestly. I mean, he just wasn't a Bonhoeffer scholar, so he got a lot of things wrong in it. But he was a traditional sort of George W. Bush Christian. He was celebrated. He hosted something called Socrates in the City, which was a kind of highbrow, I don't know, some version of We Met Buckley's Firing Line or something like that. And I think he fancied himself as a sort of Dick Cavett figure, Christian, intellectual and serious. And if you watch Eric Metaxas' career, and then he got his own radio show, he's got his own podcast, and he's just ended up into the fever swamps. And so his path, his descent into that sort of darkness, that world of conspiracy theories, the world of anger, is sort of representative, I would say, of what's happened to much of the white evangelical movement. And he has a huge following, or at least a significant following, both on his podcast and some of the books that he writes. It's not the first time that the church has gone, unfortunately, wrong. I mean, Christian history, quite honestly, is very mixed. There have been moments of great darkness and great, even evil. Look at the Christian National Church with Nazism, or the Dutch Reformed Church with apartheid in South Africa, or what happened in Rwanda when 90% of the people claimed to be Christians. Look at the Inquisition. Look at the Crusades. Look at the persecution of gays. Look at the religious wars, so-called religious wars, the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland. What happened prior to the American founding, right? What informed John Locke, who became sort of the intellectual founder of the American Republic? And why do we have the system of government that we do in terms of the distancing between faith and politics? But why did Locke want that? Well, because they had lived several centuries of these religious wars. And they said this is not a good mix. So the history of Christianity, particularly in the realm of power, is not particularly good. Christianity, people don't like to admit this. Christianity was on the wrong side of slavery for basically 1,700 years. Now, that wasn't just American slavery and chattel slavery, because that was obviously specific and awful to the American experience. But prior to that, John Edwards justified slavery scripturally. I mean, he cited, so did Whitefield, right? And then there's a very good book that Mark Knoll, the great Christian historian, wrote called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. And it is true that Christianity was the piston in the engine of the abolitionist movement, but it was also the piston in the engine of the slavery movement. Probably the most prominent figures in the American South who were arguing for chattel slavery were ministers. And they quoted the scripture to justify. Philemon today is used as one of the key texts. People say, well, obviously slavery was wrong. Philemon was the number one text used by slave advocates and slave holders who were Christians at the time. So, if Christianity contained the abolitionist movement in its DNA, it's a fair question to say, well, why did it take 1,800 years before it kind of manifested itself? Now, there were various forms of slavery. There was Roman slavery. There was Hebrew slavery. But none of those kinds of slaveries were particularly good. Nobody wanted to be a slave. Right. And so, my point is that it's a mixed history. Why it's a mixed history is something, quite honestly, I struggle with. Why is there such a gap between what I would say are the promises of the sanctified life in the New Testament? You're a new creation. You're a product of a new birth. You have access to the Holy Spirit. People who are not Christians aren't supposed to have access to that same thing. So you would imagine that if we as believers had access to the Holy Spirit, the visible sign of sanctified lives would be extraordinary. People would be able to say, whether I agree with them in terms of their doctrine or not, these people are living lives of love, of kindness, of compassion, of patience, of grace that's different than the rest of the world. And yet, in far too many examples, people will say, the angriest, most anxious-ridden, least loving people I know are often Christians. And often they're the very same people who speak most loudly on doctrine. They protect the doctrine. They portray themselves as sort of these heretic hunters, preserving, they tell themselves, the truth and the validity of the scripture. But the way that they do it is at the cost of the fruit of the Spirit. And that is a problem. I have a good friend of mine who said, as I've gotten older, I've come to view Christians much less in terms of their faithful walk, much less through where they are doctrinally, and much more in terms of where they are measured up against the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And this is actually my last question. It's been such an awesome conversation. I could keep talking for sure. But moving into the future, I guess it's kind of a two-part question, but it's what are you concerned about? And kind of what advice would you give to young Christians who are trying to navigate faith and politics right now, moving into this new season of the church and of America and all of that?
Yeah. Well, the thing I'm most concerned about is, I would say, the effort by the American right, and I'm a person who's been a lifelong conservative, so I think it's somewhat more personal to me, to annihilate truth. And I think, honestly, with the people within a lot of the Christian world, the evangelical world, the evangelical subcultures, the degree to which the very moral relativism that they have expressed concerns about for most of their lives, they've not only embraced it, but they've sort of seen the American left and raised them. We've talked about that, the conspiracy theories. So this attack on epistemology, on our capacity to know truth and know knowledge, that's, I would say, my broadest concern, because if we lose that, we lose our capacity to reason together and to the verse in Isaiah, "Come now, let us reason together." But that's hard to do if you have people who are challenging not concepts of truth, because I think people who are Christians would not say they're nihilists or they're relativists. They would say that they believe in truth. It's just that they have, in my estimation, exchanged truth for lies, and that's what they're. So that's my biggest concern in terms of, counsel to young Christians about how to navigate this moment. I suppose I'd say several things. One is for perspective, right? There's the perspective of the entirety of the Christian church, which has had ups and downs. And then there's a perspective of American history, which has had times of tremendous polarization and difficulty, whether you're talking, the first contested election in America in 1800 was Jefferson and Adams, and that was an unbelievably brutal affair. We've had moments in American history of tremendous division. Obviously, the Civil War was first among equals there, but then you had that whole period of Reconstruction and how that failed, and the rise of segregation, and then you had the 1960s, and early 70s, where in an enormously compressed period of time, you had huge convulsive social changes: Vietnam War, race riots, sexual revolution, the generation gap, riots, Kent State, the Democratic Convention in '68, where there was blood in the streets, the assassination of King and Kennedy, and so forth. And the American Republic survived, and things sort of balanced out. So perspective is important both for Christianity and I think for this country. And then I would say that in the end, each of us, particularly who are followers of Jesus, you're called to be faithful, not to be successful. You'd rather be both, obviously, but often we don't have control over whether the causes that we're fighting for are successful or not. We do have some measure of control over whether we're faithful or not. Faithful in our individual lives, in terms of the moral integrity that we have in our relationships with family, with friends, with others, the way we conduct ourselves, and the causes that we believe in and are willing to speak out about. Ultimately, I think that's how Jesus will judge us, how faithful we were to those things. And then, history is like, I would say, like individual lives in this respect, which is that often in individual lives there are inflection points. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, but life takes a turn you haven't expected. Something changes. And that happens with nations too. And sometimes they can be breakthroughs of justice, and sometimes it can be regression. But often you don't see when they're coming. And the things that people think will happen don't, and things that they never anticipated do. And what you can do is make the case as best you can, the arguments as best you can, to be as faithful as you can, and hope that the moment opens up where those arguments can carry the day. Sometimes viruses create their own antibodies. And so what America is going through, what the Christian church is going through, what the evangelical world is going through, can give rise to counter pressures and different points of view. I've heard from so many people who are, I would say, constitute the so-called exhausted majority. They're just tired of the acrimony, tired of the fighting. They don't know quite what to do about it, but they know that this is not healthy. It's not what they want to be. And from a lot of Christians who are horrified by what is the representation of the Christian world to the wider world, and they want it to change. And young people could do it. It doesn't take just young people. But I would also say that in my conversations with younger people, they are not happy. They're probably the cohort that's least happy with what they're seeing, is playing out. And I think that those who are followers of Jesus want to send a different message to the world, and they have that chance to do it. And the final thing I'd say about it is, we're actors in a drama that has an author. God is the author of that drama, and that's always given me some degree of comfort, even in my own life, through periods of pain and sorrow and loss. It's a sense that this is not the final story, and that the story that we're a part of has an author, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in that sense, we probably should hold as Christians more lightly to the things of this world, to do as much as we can for justice and for truth, but also to know that ultimately we're not in control of the story. We're not the authors of the story, and that it does have an ending, and it's a happy ending. It's an ending of justice, and we just have to take some comfort and take some peace in that.
Wow, that'll preach. By the way, is what Josh would say. My last two questions. One's easy, and the other one's is probably going to challenge you a little bit. Yeah. The first question is, how can people get a hold of you, follow your work, read your stuff? Just connect with you.
Yeah, if they just Google my name, Peter Wehner, and in terms of my essays, New York Times or The Atlantic, I wrote a piece for Plough magazine, Plough, which was a reflection on why does God allow suffering, which actually was based on the brothers Karamazov and what Dostoevsky sort of went through. So that's the easiest way. But the Trinity Forum is the institution I'm affiliated with, and they can reach me through that. And I'm pretty accessible, and I usually write back when people email to me. So I'm pretty easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. All right. So the difficult question. As a person that has read, wrote, involved themselves in the intersection of faith and politics for a long time, what would you say is the best book you've read that covers both of those topics?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's the best book that I've read. There's a recent book that just came out, which I would recommend, by Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, and Michael Bird. Tom Wright is one of the preeminent New Testament scholars in the world. He wrote what is the best book on the resurrection and Jesus that's ever been done, I think, probably in history, called Resurrection of the Son of God, I think. And Tom is in the United Kingdom, and as I said, is probably the preeminent New Testament scholar in the world. And then Michael Burden is an Australian theologian, and they wrote it's a thin book called Jesus and the Powers. I think it just came out this year, which is I think quite good and measured, and brings a thoughtful perspective. There's so many different people that you could go to. Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a very influential theologian in the 20th century, and was a kind of realist. Augustine, City of Man, and sort of the definitive work, I would say, probably in terms of understanding. I mean, Augustine was such a central figure in the evolution of Christian life. Calvin spoke about some of these issues. Abraham Kuyper, wrote about these issues, Dutch theologian. And then you have these different traditions I was mentioning, like Anabaptists and Plymouth Brethren, which are much more removed. So there are just a number of people. Mike Gerson and I wrote a book. Mike was my closest friend and was chief speechwriter of President Bush, columnist for the Washington Post, beautiful writer. He died several years ago of cancer. He and I wrote a book called City of Man, Religion and Politics in a New Era. In 2010, we actually wrote it at the request of Tim Keller, who was a close friend of mine. And, that was our take on trying to understand sort of the different currents and movements that have existed. There's a lot out there. And some of it are just different theological views about how to engage in politics. And then there's the issue, I would say, of the disposition or the temperament in which we bring to politics, regardless of what particular theology that one is a part of. And in terms of that, it'd be hard to beat, I suppose, the Sermon on the Mount. Yeah.
Have you heard of the author Tremper Longman? He's known somewhere.
Yes, I have. Yeah, Tremper's a good friend of mine, as you both may know, and he wrote actually a fascinating book. It's called the Bible and the Ballad, I think is the name of it, and also wrote a book called Old Testament Controversies. So Tremper is one of the leading Old Testament scholars in the world, and I know he's been on your show before. Mm-hmm. And Tremper has a very, I would say, measured and thoughtful understanding, and much more sophisticated than mine in terms of faith and politics, and certainly the Old Testament and politics. So, I'd go to Tremper for basically any topic on your mind.
He's great.
Yeah. His book, The Bible and the Ballot, I still recommend it to people today when they're just like, where do I start? I'm like, just read this book. Like, it's easy to read. It kind of breaks down a lot of the big social issues of the day. And don't get it confused with Caitlin Chess's book, The Ballot in the Bible.
The Ballot in the
Bible. I noticed that they're awfully close.
So, thank you so much, Peter. This has been absolutely phenomenal. We could pick your brain for, I don't know, several more hours, and I can see why Tremper enjoys talking with you, because we enjoy talking with you. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's been great to be with you guys. Thanks. It's been a terrific discussion, and I'm glad we have a mutual friend in Tremper, and maybe we can do this again at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. And to our Faithful Politics listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.